Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Edward Thomas Literary Festival, hosted by Peaceville Museum and the Edward Thomas Fellowship. If you joined us yesterday for day 1 and National Poetry Day, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you stick with us for the rest of the content for today and tomorrow. If you didn't join us yesterday, then you can catch up on everything you will have missed on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, and you can find all of those links floating around my head somewhere on screen. This morning's talk, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Nick Denton, who is a member of the Edward Thomas Fellowship, and we're going to have a look at his work in identifying the places of inspiration that Edward Thomas mentions in his poems. It's been great fun editing and putting this together, working with Nick. I've certainly learned a lot and found it fascinating, and I'm looking forward to watching it again with you. Don't forget, you can put questions to Nick in the chat and they will get picked up and taken through to the live Q&A session or the Meet the Author session after this, in which there will be a link coming up at the end of the video as well. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Nick and his fascinating talk on the places of inspiration of Edward Thomas. See you later.
Good morning. My name is Nick Denton. I'm a member of the Edward Thomas Fellowship and have been an enthusiast for Edward Thomas for many years. Since retiring last year, I've been trying to identify places of inspiration for those of his poems where locations haven't been identified yet. Some of his poems' locations are obvious. Others have been identified through the poet's writings. Some may be composite or imaginary landscapes, and some aren't identifiable. However, there are a number of poems where identification, or more precise identification, could be possible, drawing on clues from his extensive writings and observations. These include his field notebooks and letters, and other contemporary sources, as well as by walking the ground that he walked. In today's talk, which should last about 40 minutes, I will cover discoveries so far, pairing poems whose locations are already well known with others where they are not, putting them in the context of the countryside in England and Wales that Edward Thomas knew and loved. I'll also briefly outline my current and future lines of inquiry, before opening up for questions, where comments, insights, and any other ideas would be very welcome. Before I begin, as well as walking in the footsteps of Edward Thomas, I've also been following paths pioneered by a number of Edward Thomas scholars. Of these in particular, I should mention Edna Longley, who has done more than anyone in the last 50 years to advance Edward Thomas's reputation as a poet, Matthew Hollis, who's charted Edward Thomas's last 4 years as he became a poet in his book Now All Roads Lead to France, and W.M. Whiteman, whose Edward Thomas Country identified many of the locations of poems around Steep. One could argue that Edward Thomas's poems, where there is considerable, often considered ambiguity, do not need tying down to a particular location, that they're universal, or that such tying down would detract from the personal associations that individuals have created in their own imagination. Edward Thomas was known to shift things around to suit his writing. For instance, the itineraries of the Icknield Way and In Pursuit of Spring, and many of the places described, for instance in the South Country and beautiful Wales, are purposefully anonymised. I have a lot of sympathy with this argument. This is really a quixotic retirement quest, but I would hope it would in a small way enhance appreciation of Edward Thomas as the supreme poet of nature and the countryside in his generation, and arguably for the last 100 years. I also hope it will encourage more people to get to know the countryside that inspired him and come to their own conclusions. It's still very much out there, and much of what he loved is not yet appreciated properly, in my view, and is too often passed by. A key source are his field notebooks in the Berg collection in New York. These are difficult to access unless you visit, but have already been well mined by Edna Longley, Matthew Hollis, and many more. As there are 80 in total, with some interesting handwriting to decipher, there's scope for new discoveries. Ben Mackay, a committee member of the Edward Thomas Fellowship, spent a month last year in New York transcribing some of the notebooks and listing their contents for his project around the route of In Pursuit of Spring. I would like to pay tribute to him for this work, which has thrown up some very interesting findings on a number of poems, of which more later. The list of contents for each field notebook that Ben transcribed is also instructive, as it provides insights into some journeys Thomas made and obviously thought were noteworthy, which have not necessarily been picked up from other documentary material. For instance, he made several journeys beyond the South Downs Ridge, south of Petersfield and Burraton, to the villages of Charlton, Finchdean, Idsworth, Rowland Castle and Stansted, which run down the downland valley of the Lavant stream. It was clearly an area he was attracted back to. They also show his annual trip to Goodwood. He doesn't seem to have missed a visit to Goodwood races in August from 1909 to 1914, with the possible exception of 1912. And further afield, Wales features in 11 of his field notebooks between 1906 and 1914. Edward Thomas was a precise observer. His approach on a walk was to look and learn, something he did rigorously, jotting down his observations directly into his field notebooks. He was a prodigious walker as well as a keen cyclist, who covered more miles across the South Country and in Wales in his short life than his contemporaries travelled in a full lifetime. He had a good eye for country and was always looking for the best of it, making the most of what he came across in his prose. And everywhere he went, he would get to know the locality, as well as the countryside and natural history. The local history through the churchyard, its monuments and gravestones, the great houses and their families, describing the locals he came across, and of course, the pubs. W.M. Whiteman first wrote his wonderful short work, The Edward Thomas Country, in the 1970s. It focused on the country round Steep, where the Thomases lived for over 10 years, including the period when he wrote almost all of his poetry. However, one could argue that Edward Thomas Country is much wider than this. As well as Hampshire, the Hangers and the Sussex Downs, it would also include southern and mid Wales, especially Carmarthenshire, Gloucestershire, especially around the Leaden Valley, Dimmock and May Hill, the whole of Wiltshire, the North Downs, Ashdown Forest, the Ridgeway and Icknield Way, and Essex, including Epping Forest. So all of this country and beyond is where he drew inspiration for his later poetry. Quite a few of the old haunts he didn't revisit after the war started. He began to write his poetry a few months later, at the end of 1914. But he did get to know Essex from the standpoint of his two military training camps at High Beach, Epping Forest, and Hare Hall Camp, Romford. And he returned to Wiltshire and Somerset to military camps in the last few months before embarking for France. But as a writer and observer, he had a vast range of material, which when he became a poet he could draw on. Robert Frost, his poetic mentor, encouraged him to use his prose works, for instance In Pursuit of Spring, for his poetry, but there were also his field notebooks and other material. So in all of this, as well as his immediate surroundings, which became increasingly important to him as a poet, there are clues that can be used to identify places of inspiration for his poetry. Before looking at some of the poems in more detail, here are some figures. Of his 140 poems, around 100 or so may have locations which can be identified. Of these, around half are well known or have already been identified in part. So there's approximately 50 to be identified and 24 more where more precise identification may be possible. By area, and inevitably this is more speculative, about a third are probably from around Steep, Froxfield and the Hangers, with around a further 15 or so from Hampshire and the Downs, so around half in total from his immediate locality. 20% were possibly inspired by Essex, another 20% split three ways from Wales, Wiltshire and the Leaden Valley, Dimmock and May Hill, with a handful inspired by Ashdown Forest, and then London and the Quantocks, Carnforth, the Ridgeway, each inspiring a poem or two. Quite a few poems have been inspired by two or more locations, and of course, just to reiterate, for many poems, much of this will remain speculative, as it will never be possible to know precisely what was in his mind's eye when he wrote them. So I have taken a selection of poems in pairs, one with well-known location and the other not known to date. The first two are the mill water and the mill pond. The mill water describes the mill race on Ashford Stream in Steep, by day and by night drowning or inspiring his thoughts. It's clearly a place he knew well and frequently passed by. He and his family would have regularly used the path that goes past the mill race, to school at Bedales, to Steep Village, and to his study on top of Ashford Hanger. You will get to see it later in a reading of the poem. The location of the poem The Mill Pond, on the other hand, is more obscure. It has the feeling of a place he's just visiting on a humid summer day before the storm breaks. He wrote the poem in the early period of his poetry, in January 1915, when he was laid up at home with a badly sprained ankle, drawing on memories and his previous writings for inspiration. In his field notebook for 15th of June 1914, he mentions a visit to Trotton, or Terwick Mill, in the Rother Valley, a few miles east of Steep, a place he had visited on at least one other occasion. The Met Office archives show thunderstorms and torrential downpours in the south during that day. The mill pond at Trotton is still quite gloomy, surrounded by alders and aspens, wagtails still flicker bright, and the South Downs lie serenely in the distance. Two other poems draw inspiration close to the source of Ashford Stream, between Stoner Hill and Ashford Hangers. The first, The Combe, has long been identified with Lutcombe Bottom. Again, there's a feeling that Thomas knew this place very well, and despite the line, "and no one scrambles over the sliding chalk by beech and yew and perishing juniper," one gets the feeling that the poet has done exactly that, negotiating the half precipices and using the rabbit holes for steps up and down the steep-sided combe. His observation that the winter sun and summer moon would never shine directly into the combe is typically precise, given the position of the combe curving northeast. He wrote Bright Clouds over a year later, in June 1916, when a map trainer at Harehall Camp in Romford. He yet to take the decision on whether to go to France to fight, which may explain its almost Zen-like tone. The pond could be in Essex, but it seems more likely it was much closer to his home in Steep. He came home for a weekend in early June, and probably wrote this poem on the way back to camp. He would typically visit his study in the garden of the Red House, at the top of Ashford Hill, on these days of leave. One of the ways up from Yew Tree Cottage passes the dammed pond at the entrance of Lutcombe. The pond, on a 1909 Ordnance Survey map, is in fields rather than wooded, and was probably fringed by hawthorn, the May in the poem which falls in June. There is little hawthorn in the wooded surrounds now, but there are reeds in the pond and a family of moorhen. Ashford Hangers and its environs is very much his heartland. He would walk up and down, often twice daily, and along the sides, enjoying the views of the Rother Valley, the South Downs, from Butser Hill to the hills above Lewes, a distance of more than 50 miles. When First is a valedictory poem, as he contemplates leaving Steep permanently. It is famously linked to the shoulder of Mutton Hill, where the poet's stone, which many of you will be familiar with, was set up in remembrance of Thomas 20 years after his death in 1937. He walked up and down its steps of chalk regularly, and there are many observations on the hill and of the views jotted down in his field notebooks. Less obviously, his earlier poem Ambition may also have been inspired by the view from Shoulder of Mutton on a very different day. The poem seems to have drawn partially on references from the South Country and In Pursuit of Spring, at times when he would have been at home in Steep, where he would often describe the daily changes in weather, atmospheric conditions, and land and skyscape. The view from Shoulder of Mutton Hill encompassed two railway lines, the Portsmouth to London line and the Petersfield to Midhurst line, where steam engines would have regularly come and gone, one of which could have created that white bar of purest cloud from end to end close-knit. Many other poems that are well known for being inspired by the Ashford Hangers, the path and the chalk pit at the opposite end of the range of hangers are noteworthy. The path follows the road up from Steep to Froxfield under Stoner Hill. Sadly, it's largely disappeared as a result of road modernisation, widening and repairing, and the going is pretty hard and at times impassable. but you still get views down to Lutcombe Bottom, which are, as Thomas describes, looking down the long smooth steep between the legs of beech and yew to where a fallen tree checked the site. Many more trees now seem to have fallen, so the view is often more cluttered. There is one point at the corner as the road curves steeply round as you ascend, where you can see the red house up on the ridge on the other side of the Combe. You can see it in the large picture on the slide. One can imagine Edward Thomas or Helen and their children shouting their trademark "cooey" at that point to let those up above know they would be arriving in a few minutes. The chalk pit is at the other end of the Ashford escarpment, below Weetham Hill. As Edna Longley and others have pointed out, Edward Thomas had something of an obsession with chalk pits, which pocked the hangers and the downs all around. The chalk had long ceased to be used as a fertiliser in his day. The atmosphere of a just deserted stage is still as he describes, and ash still predominate, but for how much longer? The top of Weetham Hill was mentioned in May the 23rd, Thomas's poem on Jack Norman, a friend and one of the tramps and itinerants that Thomas was so fond of. Here Jack picks the cowslips which he adds to the watercress he has taken illicitly from the Oakshott stream below, before arriving at the poet's house, probably the Red House on Cockshott Lane, and gifting them to him. Weetham Hill may also have been the site of the Glory. This early morning poem, written at a time when Thomas was spending all his time at Steep researching his life of the Duke of Marlborough, could be inspired by the view from Shoulder of Mutton Hill, or indeed other viewpoints on his other walks. However, as he would often be precise in his descriptions, the mention of forest could be an important clue. Within the viewpoints in the vicinity of Steep, this is most probably Woolmer Forest, to the east towards Haslemere. An excellent view of the forest, together with meadows and sky, can be had from the top of Weetham Hill. Beyond the hangars, Thomas would take off for a day or more on long walks. His wife Helen describes him in her memoir World Without End as coming out of his study and saying, "I've got stuck with this damn review. Come on, let's go to Selborne. You've never been there. We needn't touch roads at all. You'll love it, and I know a woodpecker's nest." Two of his sign-off letters in Letters to Robert Frost were, "I love to you all, and I wish you were all within reach this side or the other side of the Downs," and "I wish you were a day's walk away." So he would walk to Walter de la Mare's summer holiday house at West Harting, to friends further north in the hangars towards Selborne, Goodwood for the races in August along the Downs, meeting with Eleanor Farjon, his great friend at Haslemere or on the Downs, and bicycling over to the Guthrie family. James Guthrie was another close friend who was a printer-publisher, at Flansham on the coast south of Arundel. A bike ride over to the latter may have been the genesis of the composition of These Things Also, written shortly after the trip, which describes what remains of winter as spring arrives in Downland. Further afield, another pair of poems, Sedge Warblers and The Unknown Bird, one well known, one not known for its location. Sedge Warblers he wrote from field notes he made in May 1915 on a bike ride with his elder daughter Bronwyn, beyond Warnford in the Meon Valley. The location must have been south of Warnford Park, whose fallen chestnut trees' flowers have curdled to one sheet in the river. The most likely spot is close to the current footbridge over the Meon on the path up to Old Winchester Hill, now part of the South Downs Way from Exton. There are still sedge warblers here in the willows and reeds, which sing longer than the lark, quick, shrill or grating, a song to match the heat of the strong sun, nor less the waters cool. And the river Meon gushes through, radiant, racing, clear. As Edna Longley says, this poem prompted the accolade that Edward Thomas was the major English bird poet of the 20th century. Another poem that would not have got Thomas that accolade is The Unknown Bird. Thomas never claimed to be scientific or a naturalist, though his observation and listening skills were exceptional. He wrote the poem while laid up in that early January of 1915, so he would have been turning to his field notebooks for material. Those from around 4 to 5 years previously include walks south of the Downs to Charlton, Vidgedene and Idstock in May and June. On the lane south from Burraton through the Downs, there are still great beech woods where few birds sing in summer, and when one does, it can sound as if a cock crowed past the edge of the world. More specific evidence may be found in entries to these field notebooks, 31 and 34, in the Burke collection. Further afield, Thomas's many visits to Wales were a source of inspiration for a number of poems. He wrote his prose book, Beautiful Wales, in 1906. Like the South Country, much of the description is anonymised, but in the earlier chapters he gave a list with typical Thomas humour of all the famous places he hadn't ever seen in Wales, the more fashionable north round Snowdonia and much of the coast. As these were also the subjects the illustrator was focusing on, it created something of a mismatch in the book. He then goes on to the places, hills and rivers he did know and love. By far the largest grouping is in Carmarthenshire. From his childhood he would stay with his relatives at Manford and Pontarddulais, and then walk out into the country, over the hills and along the rivers and streams. You can see from the map that the places he loved encircle the Black Mountain on the east, the Towie Valley and Carmarthen to the west. It's beautiful empty country with always another hill just poking above the horizon and long views over rolling pastures and moors and up and across the river valleys with just the sound of water and wind. Of the Welsh poems, one of the most famous is Over the Hills. He wrote it in January 1915 while laid up at home. Draws on long ago memories of a Welsh landscape. The lake is probably the Llyn y Fan Fac, below the Banaws y Gaer, a peak of the Black Mountain, not the Black Mountains. The lake rests as in the hollow of a collarbone under the mountain. He walked here with his friend Gwilly, the Welsh poet, and they also visited the Red Lion pub in Llandusant, a couple of miles away. The River Sword comes down from the lake as a torrent and series of waterfalls to below Llandusant. The ridge passing to a new country in the poem could either be one of the ridges on the Black Mountain, the Forest Four, or other hills to the north. More exploration is required to discover its possible whereabouts. The Red Lion was a favourite pub, and there are many others. In his prose book he would religiously jot down lists of all the inns on his travels. In his day, even small villages could have a dozen public houses. In his poetry, there are a number of references to pubs and inns. He writes extensively about the pub with no name, the White Horse, at Prior's Dean, in his first poem, Up in the Wind. If you don't know it, you'll get a chance to see it later as a reading of Up in the Wind in situ. The Cricketers Inn at Steep, his local at Yew Tree Cottage, is referred to in Aspens, another poem that we read in situ later. In For These, a description of an idealised retreat from the world, written as he was about to join up, he mentions the rising sun, which is probably the one at West Bagborough in the Quantocks in Somerset, below Cothelstone Hill, where his journey in pursuit of spring ended. Other pub references appear in The Owl, The Watchers and The Other, all possibly Wiltshire establishments. In A Private, which is definitely a Wiltshire poem, there is a mention of a made-up pub, Mrs. Greenland's Hawthorn Bush, where the ploughman jokingly said he slept. He was actually sleeping under a hawthorn bush on a Wiltshire down. Thomas also mentions what sounds like an actual pub, the Drover, where presumably the ploughman drank among the uncongenial locals he was teasing. I haven't managed to track down the precise historic Drover pub in Wiltshire yet, but is it too fanciful to extrapolate that another pub, called the Plough on the Hill, underneath Liddington Castle, was also in his mind? Liddington, an old Neolithic fort, is a Wiltshire down overlooking Swindon, and it was a favourite haunt of Thomas and his hero Richard Jefferies. The pub, established in 1870, is in view of the top of Liddington, which is crowned in hawthorn bushes, above Plough Hill, after which the pub is named. There is a very precise reference to this story in the Field Notebook 54. A hardy drinker, sleeping out on a frosty night, says he stayed at Mrs. Greenland's hawthorn bush. This field notebook is dated very specifically 10th to 12th of May 1912, so over 2 years before the war started, and even longer before Thomas wrote the private. The field notebook title includes 2 locations, one being Chiseldon, just round the corner from the Plough on the Hill. It might be a further private play on words in a poem that ends so soberly, with the ploughman, like so many rural workers, presumed dead in France. Too fanciful, I suspect. I will keep searching for the drover inn. Maybe less fanciful is the possible genesis of I Built Myself a House of Glass. He wrote this poem the night before he and his friend Jack Haynes were going off to revisit Mayhill on their bikes in June 1915, part of a longer trip Thomas was taking after completing his life of the Duke of Marlborough, and before taking the decision to join the army. Thomas had fond memories of this hill, as it was the visual focal point of the Leaden Valley, where he had spent many happy weeks with Robert Frost the year before, and the hill was often the outward point of their walks. So this trip was a reminder of these happy times, and also a reminder of the period in which he was encouraged by Frost to become a poet. He writes in a letter to Robert Frost, then back in America, a few days before he starts, that he has only the map to look at before setting out, something he typically did. Afterwards he writes to Frost, "We went to Mayhill from another side, but not to the crest or any of the points we touched." As he was biking from Huddlecote, Gloucester, in the east, rather than walking from the north to Mayhill, this route would have taken him a different way, far or close to the village and pub of Glasshouse, named from the glasswork that had been developed on this hill by the Huguenot refugees in the 17th century. Did the name catch his attention as he looked at the map, and did this prompt the short poem about his acute self-consciousness? More certainly, the following day, on the side of Mayhill overlooking the Leaden Valley, with far views to Wales, the Malvern Hills, Cotswolds and the Forest of Dean, he jotted down a draft of words, his poem celebrating the craft of poetry in the countryside where he first envisaged becoming a poet. Mayhill looks out over the Leaden Valley, in which it is always a discreet though noticeable presence. The sleepy, muddy Leaden Valley winds slowly between its tree-bound banks through fields. Some orchards and pasture remains, but much is now arable. The landscape is domesticated. The houses that the Frost and Thomas families stayed in still overlook each other and are a short walk away. This was the landscape where the sun used to shine, where Thomas walked with Robert Frost. Slowly together, paused and started, again, and sometimes mused, sometimes talked as either pleased, and cheerfully parted. This landscape also appears briefly in a dream, written shortly after he returned from his trip to Mayhill. It involved Frost, the old friend, and Thomas walking through these familiar fields before Thomas loses his friend and comes to a strange stream in a strange landscape. As others have pointed out, there is a distinct Coleridgean influence, with the strange stream seeming to be a smaller version of the River Alf in Coleridge's Kubla Khan. But there is also a distinct Welsh feel to the stream and the changed landscape where the poet finds himself. The Upper Neath is one candidate. In his short prose piece Penderyn, written in 1914, he describes a walk going up the upper stretches of the Neath in view of the Brecon beacons from the south, before turning back to climb to Penderyn. In the piece he talks of the river poured out into the light under ash trees, and in one place ran black underground. Another candidate is the resurgence of the river Lofar. This occurs at the eye of the Lofar, where a torrent issues from an extensive limestone cave system and a vast underground lake under the western side of the Black Mountain. It's an impressive sight, with the black torrent coming out of the rocky hillside and from under the alders into dazzling light, splitting into 3 streams which flow swiftly, even in summer, through marsh, pasture and wood. It's nearly in sight of Carrig Kennan, one of Thomas's favourite ruined castles. In Beautiful Wells he describes the Lochar as a river whose voice is bright in constant shadow. His famous poem, Roads, draws on the first chapter of the Icknield Way, which starts off, "Much has been written of travel, far less of roads." In both the chapter and the poem, there is a strong Welsh element. In the poem, he writes of Helen of the roads, the mountain ways of Wales, and the Mabinogion tales being one of the true gods. The Sarn Helen is a series of ancient roads across Wales, which you'll find marked on Ordnance Survey maps. They're very probably Roman roads, though Geoffrey of Monmouth and Edward Thomas connects them with Ellen, daughter of a Welsh chieftain and married to a Roman soldier who had imperial ambitions. Supposedly she commanded these high roads to be built, joining the castles of Carmarthen, Carnarvon and Caerleon across Wales. And as Thomas says, the name also suggests St Helen, mother of the Emperor Constantine, founder of Byzantium. As one historian says, the derivation of Sarn Helen is likely to remain a tantalising mystery. There is still an ancient road from Llandovery over the hills to Tredegar, which Thomas mentioned specifically in the Icknield Way, and was a road he knew well from his walking in mid-Wales. He also came across a southern offshoot of Sarn Helen in the Upper Neath Valley when he did his walk to Penderyn. These ancient hill roads still have the enduring, lonely, panoramic and inspiring qualities that Thomas describes of the roads in his poem. As do the Downland roads. In Roads, Thomas brings us explicitly back to the Downs as he turns his attention from the ancient military ways of Wales to the roads that lead to France, over the Downs to the seaports where soldiers are transported out to the trenches and the injured brought back. Again, he'd be very familiar with these, the way along the North Downs to Dover and Folkestone, and the ways across the South Downs to other key channel ports such as Newhaven, Portsmouth and Southampton. Southampton was military boarding point number 1, a position it retained throughout the war. It was also a major receiving point of the wounded, for instance taking on many of those wounded at the Somme. From his viewpoint, the South Downs he loved, Butser, Old Winchester Hill, South Harting Down, Beacon Hill, may at first have been the ramparts between his England and France. But the solitary ways of Downland that he used to tramp in his imagination were now full of the living, the wounded and the dead, going to and returning from war in loops. It must have continually prompted the question, how much longer before he joined them? Southampton was where he was to embark in January 1917, when he finally went to France. He never came back. He was killed at the Battle of Arras on 9th of April 1917 and is buried in the Agni Military Cemetery. Before concluding, I thought I'd run through a couple of other poems where identifying the location is work in progress, juxtaposing them with 2 further poems where the location is well known. The Manor House is well known as being the one at Prior's Dean, round the hangers from Steep. With the small parish church and its yew tree opposite, it's a traditional English scene, and the poem brings out a key Thomas theme of how different seasons can quickly follow each other in one day, indeed 1 hour, and seem to merge together. The poem appropriately featured in his anthology This England, among his first published poetry anywhere under the pseudonym Edward Easterway. His other poem published in this anthology was Haymaking, another English idyll whose provenance is much less certain. The field notebooks provide some clues. Field notebook 80 from 1915, much of which has been transcribed by Ben Mackay, includes many entries that have early drafts of some of his poems. There are quite a few notes about the poem Haymaking, with some specific mentions of villages. The most extensive talks about a park mead by thin grass mown by White Parish, a Wiltshire village close to Salisbury, south of the beautiful Pepperbox, Dean Hill range of chalk downs. Thomas had biked past these when en route to Somerset in pursuit of spring. White Parish is in the borderland between the Wiltshire chalk downs and the New Forest. He sees in it elements of what became his vision of England: the haymakers under a solitary yew, the tosser lying idle, men leaning on their rakes, a chalk pit brimmed with hazel and flowering elder. It's difficult to identify precisely where this is in White Parish, as the geography doesn't quite fit. The nearest approximation could be around Cowsfield Manor on the eastern edge of White Parish, which has on either side a chalk pit farm and a yew tree farm, and as in the poem, a field slopes down to the willows, which shows where the brook is. Some old granges can be found in local farmyards. Grange in the archaic sense of granary. So when he refers at the end to all of us gone out of reach of change, immortal as a picture of an old grange, it's probably not the large country house we now associate with Grange that he is seeing, but a small ancient granary. A complicating factor is that the mill stream, mentioned towards the start of Haymaking, is described in the same terms as he did the Compton Chamberlain Mill in the field notebook, some 15 miles away, the other side of Salisbury, in the Nadder Valley. So as with other poems, Haymaking is likely to prove a composite, drawn from several recollections. More may be identified with further exploration, looking at the old maps, and talking with local historians. The lane in the eponymous poem is well known as the Green Lane off to the left on the main road from Petersfield to Winchester, via Stoner Hill and the Froxfield Plateau, after the Trooper Inn and before the pub with no name is reached. The poem, one of the last he wrote, is like when first, a valedictory one remembering blackberrying with Helen there in September 1916. The lane still has lots of blackberries and bracken, with its hedges grown into bushes of holly, elder, hazel and hawthorn, underneath ash and oak, with chaffinches singing in them. Bob's Lane, in Women He Liked, is much more obscure. The name of the amorous, elm-loving farmer, old Hayward of the Heath, sounds made up. There's a Bob's Lane in Twynham, near Hayward's Heath, which may have been in his mind. Yet more likely, there is a Bob's Lane, which Thomas would have seen and used regularly during his military training. He wrote the poem in the early part of 1916, when he was based at Hare Hall, Gidea Park. This Bob's Lane was a track over the old Romford Common, just north of Gidea Park. He would have taken or walked past Bob's Lane on many of his personal walks and map training exercises into the Essex countryside. It's now on a golf course, Risebridge, still marked as a footpath. However, as far as I can ascertain, there was also never a railway line close enough for the travellers from a slow-moving train to be able to hear the thrush singing in the elms the farmer had planted. So another poem where more needs to be done to see if there are other influences. For this talk, I've focused on some of the poems from Hampshire, the Hangers and the South Downs, Carmarthenshire and Gloucestershire, and there's much more to be done for each, as you can see. But there are many other areas. I've hardly touched on Essex, where his 10 months in the 2 training camps there resulted in nearly 20 poems that may have been inspired by Essex locations. Certainly the poems he writes for his children draw on a wide range of interesting sounding Essex field names, farms and villages, which you can see on the map. There may have been an additional influence in his poems of this period. Thomas had always loved maps since childhood, and by early 1916 he was proficient in military map reading, panoramic drawing and military sketching, and had become an instructor. This way of looking at the country may have influenced the perspective he takes of the landscape in a number of his Essex poems. There may have also been a reaction to the limitations of map reading and looking at the country just for military purposes. For instance, the dryness of the military descriptions of roads in map training manuals may have sparked his opening line in Roads, the poem, beginning, "I love roads." Another undoubted influence was Epping Forest, which seems to have been significant in a number of his poems, from October to Out in the Dark. It was a place he got to know in his first military training camp at High Beach, and then walked to as frequently as he could while he was in Hare Hall Camp in Romford, over 10 miles away, a mere stroll for Thomas. Another forest, Ashdown Forest, was an area where he had some strong recollections from which he produced a handful of poems. The autumn and winter of 1913 had been a dark, turbulent period for Thomas, when he chose to spend a long time away from his family to focus on his work, staying with his friends, the Loch Ellises at Selsfield House, south of East Grinstead. Some of the poems focus on the darkness a mysterious hollowed land hatched with the gills of the forest and peopled by those on the margins of society, the gypsies and the charcoal burners, who Edward Thomas was so drawn to. As Jean Moorcroft Wilson has pointed out in her recent biography of Thomas, he also wrote his earliest adult poem there in 1913, after spending a restless night listening to the 100 firs in the wind on the Ardingly Road above Selsfield House. The 7th of September, the sear and the ember, of the year and of me, there will always be firs to moan and robins to sing at cold dawn. Again, there is more work to be done exploring the gills and paths of Ashdown Forest, especially those close to Selsfield House, as well as to see if more can be gleaned from his 2 field notebooks for that period. And then there's Wiltshire, land of childhood memories, Richard Jefferies and white horses, which he crisscrossed so many times throughout his life in his perambulations on foot and bike. Wiltshire he draws on for the great epic journeys and tales of Lob and the Other. In many ways he knew this country the best, from the river valleys of Salisbury to the hills above Swindon, Devizes and Marlborough, Salisbury Plain and its borders, the cottage of his oldest old friend, Dad Ousel, who taught him so much about nature, his stays at Dillybrook Farm near the River Frome, and house parties and cricket matches with the Baxes at Broughton Gifford. Some of these memories go back to his childhood and early adulthood, which come through in poems such as It Was a Pond and The Child in the Orchard. In each of these areas there are forests, chapels, gamekeeper cottages, parks, pubs, hills, streams, combes and gills to explore, and hopefully discover more of what Edward Thomas had in mind in his poems. To finish, I thought I should touch briefly on what must be his best-known location, as well as his best-known poem, Addlestrop. Ironically, it's a place he knew only fleetingly, when his train stopped there unexpectedly. But it does show his creative genius to really understand and appreciate somewhere fully, and to use his words to sum up the moment and the place, and in doing so to create something which is both eternally real and mythic for so many. When Eleanor Farjohn asked Thomas why he wanted to fight, he replied by picking up a handful of earth, crumbling it, and saying, "Literally for this." So it seems right that as well as reading his poetry and prose, to honour his name and remember him, we should also walk the ground that he walked, and try to see the land through his eyes. This is something the Edward Thomas Fellowship has been encouraging since their foundation in the 1970s. And the Petersfield Museum is planning to do more when they reopen with their Edward Thomas Study Centre. As I said at the beginning, Edward Thomas's country is still very much out there, waiting to be explored.
And there you have it. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Like I said, truly fascinating, and you must have had such a good time going out and having a look at all of these places and finding them and doing those walks. It certainly makes me want to go out and explore more all of these places that were in Edward Thomas's poetry. So no, thank you very much. I hope you watching enjoyed it as much as I did and are able to join us for the question and answer session, which is coming up live on Zoom shortly. But before we go, just a reminder that you can catch up on everything related to the Edward Thomas Literary Festival by clicking on the links floating around my head, and you can also help support Petersfield Museum in creating more digital content like this in these difficult times by following the link that is up on the screen now. So I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing you in the question and answer session with Nick very, very shortly.